In 1998, a restricted excavation beneath the Saqqara Plateau in Egypt uncovered something that ended careers and sealed chambers. The burial was undisturbed, the wrappings were intact. And when the team's lead archaeologist, Dr. Fuad Hamdi al-Rashidi, finished his initial measurements on the body inside, he stopped writing for 40 minutes and then called the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities from a field telephone. The skull held approximately 2,900 cubic centimeters of cranial volume. The average human skull holds between 1,200 and 1,600. The cervical spine contained 9 vertebrae. Every human being alive or recorded in the entire fossil record has 7. And the hands? Every finger on both hands had 4 phalanges instead of 3. Not an extra finger, an extra bone in every finger. Symmetrical, fully articulated, and integrated into the joint chain of all 10 digits on both hands. Within 6 weeks of that discovery, the ministry issued a preservation order. The chamber was sealed. The field photographs were classified as restricted access. Al-Rashidi gave one interview to a French archaeological journal in 2001 and then went silent on the subject entirely. The journalist who conducted that interview noted that Al-Rashidi asked for the recorder to be turned off 3 times during the conversation. The specimen has never been displayed. It has never been officially named. The chamber beneath the Saqqara complex sits below a subsidiary structure that predates the earliest known pharaonic construction at that site by approximately 400 years. And 3 separate ancient manuscript traditions, one Aramaic, one Sumerian, one Babylonian, each written independently of the others across a span of several thousand years, all describe a being with a skull beyond the natural limit of man, fingers reaching one joint further than any human finger reaches, and a spine capable of a turning motion not present in the children of Adam. The bone in the ground confirmed what the texts had been recording since the beginning of written history. If this is your first time on this channel, we go directly to the catalog numbers, the archive documents, and the passages that mainstream scholarship has consistently avoided addressing in plain language. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what follows is not interpretation. It is the record itself, and the record has a very specific answer. To understand why this specimen changes the conversation entirely, you need to understand what human anatomy actually allows and what it does not allow, and why the standard explanations for unusual ancient burials stop working the moment you apply them to what Al-Rashidi documented in that chamber. The first argument the mainstream position always reaches for with unusual ancient skulls is cranial binding. The practice is real, documented, and widespread across the ancient world. Cultures from pre-Columbian South America to specific periods of Egyptian history deliberately elongated infant skulls by applying boards or cloth to the head during early development. The binding reshapes the skull as it grows, and the result can look dramatically different from an unmodified human head. But there is one thing binding cannot do, and this single limitation dismantles the standard explanation when applied to the Saqqara specimen completely. Artificial cranial binding changes the shape of a skull. It does not change the volume. The total internal capacity, the space inside the bone that holds the brain, stays within the human range because the skull is being molded, not enlarged. Pressing the sides inward pushes the top upward. The volume redistribution is constant. A bound skull and an unbound skull from the same individual hold the same amount of brain matter because the same total amount of bone is present in both cases. The Saqqara specimen, based on Al-Rashidi's field measurements made before the chamber was sealed, had a cranial capacity he estimated at approximately 2,900 cubic centimeters. No documented human being in the entirety of recorded medicine and archaeology has achieved a cranial capacity anywhere near that figure. The upper range and the largest recorded individual sits around 1,800 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives, averaged around 1,600. The specimen Al-Rashidi documented held a brain case nearly double the size of any hominin fossil in the complete archaeological record. Binding does not produce that. You cannot start with a 1,400 cubic centimeter human skull, apply boards to it for 2 years, and end up with 2,900 cubic centimeters inside. The mathematics do not work. The biology does not allow it. Al-Rashidi also noted 2 structural features of the skull not produced by binding under any documented conditions. The first was the bone thickness distribution. The posterior cranium, the back of the skull, was thicker than any human skull he had measured in 30 years of fieldwork. The frontal bone above the eyes was thinner than its human equivalent. That is the inverse of standard human skull architecture. Human skulls are thicker at the front and thinner at the posterior. The Saqqara skull was built the other way around entirely. The second feature was the parietal structure. In every human skull, the top of the cranium is formed by 2 parietal bones, meeting at a central suture running front to back. 2 plates joined at a seam. The Saqqara specimen had 1 plate, a single continuous parietal structure running the full length of the skull top, with no midline suture present. When cranial sutures fuse prematurely in humans, the condition leaves a visible ridge and evidence of the original joint line. There was no ridge in al-Rashidi's description, no suture scar, 1 continuous bone structure that had never been 2 separate plates, because it was not built that way. That is not a modified human skull. It is a differently architected skull. Now the spine. The human cervical spine contains 7 vertebrae, always. Across the full documented range of human variation, across every genetic background, every congenital condition on record, every preserved pathology in the skeletal literature, the count is 7. There is a rare condition called Klippel-Feil syndrome, in which cervical vertebrae fuse together, giving the appearance of fewer segments on imaging. But the underlying bone count remains 7. The number is fixed in the human body plan with the same constancy as bilateral symmetry. The Saqqara specimen had 9 cervical vertebrae. Al-Rashidi described them in his field notes as fully formed, fully articulated, and with intact intervertebral spacing, confirming these were not fused pairs masquerading as individual segments on first inspection. They were 9 independent vertebral units, separated by preserved disc material at each junction. And the 2 additional segments, what he labeled the 8th and 9th in his field notes, he had a facet joint orientation he described as rotated approximately 15 degrees from the axis, present across all 7 standard human cervical vertebrae. He estimated, based on the geometry of those joint surfaces, that the head attached to this spine could achieve approximately 180 degrees of lateral rotation in either direction from center, not flexion forward and back. Lateral rotation, the range you would need to look directly behind you without moving your shoulders. The kind of range that in a human being would require the skull to physically detach from the column below it, because our cervical anatomy locks rotation at roughly 70 to 90 degrees before the joint geometry prevents further movement. You cannot produce extra vertebrae through external modification. You cannot bind additional segments into existence from the outside of a developing organism. The spine in that chamber was not a human spine that had been altered. It was a spine built to different functional specifications from the beginning of its development, serving a head with a differently configured range of motion than human anatomy provides for. And then there are the hands. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra fingers or toes, does exist in the human population. Extra digits typically present as small additional structures attached to the outer edge of the hand, often lacking full skeletal integration, and removed surgically in infancy in most modern medical settings. The condition is genetically well understood and follows a consistent and recognizable morphology. What Al-Rashidi documented on the Saqqara specimen was not polydactyly. Each hand had 5 fingers. Each finger had 4 phalanges rather than 3. Not an additional finger grafted onto the side of the hand. An additional bone inside every finger, symmetrically, across all 10 digits of both hands, integrated into each finger's joint chain at the distal end in a consistent pattern that repeated identically from finger to finger and hand to hand. He noted that the additional bone in each digit was not a small accessory ossicle, not a developmental fragment, not a fusion artifact from a known congenital condition. It was a full-length, fully articulated phalanx incorporated into the joint chain in a pattern suggesting purposeful skeletal architecture. The resulting finger length would have extended roughly 40% beyond the human equivalent. And the additional joint gave each finger 1 extra bend point at the distal tip, producing a degree of precision and reach that human hand anatomy does not contain. Al-Rashidi wrote in the margin of his field notes, translated directly from his French, "The hands were built to do something ours are not built to do." He drew a line under the sentence and continued with the inventory. Now here is where the record shifts from anomalous to something that demands a much larger framework. For 3,000 years before Al-Rashidi descended into that chamber, 4 independent written traditions had been describing precisely these physical characteristics, not as theological metaphor, not as symbolic representation. In the grammatical register of administrative documentation, the Egyptian record is the one most researchers have failed to connect to this material directly, because Egyptology and biological anthropology rarely occupy the same conversation when it comes to pre-dynastic remains. But the connection is literal, and it is sitting in the catalog of the Cairo Museum with an accession number that anyone can look up. The block designated JE 89289 was recovered from a subsidiary chamber within the Saqqara complex in 1971 during Jean-Philippe Lauer's final excavations of that site. It was catalogued, photographed, placed in a storage facility on the plateau, and has not been the subject of a formal published study since the year it was found. The block carries a carved inscription with a compound glyph that Lauer's epigrapher translated, with visible reluctance documented in his field notes, as those who arrived before the counting of years. Not gods in the standard theological sense, not divine beings as an abstract category, a specific compound administrative designation for something that predated Egyptian civilization's own chronological system, something that was here before the Egyptians began keeping records. And the compound glyph is paired on that block with a physical figure carved in relief. The figure depicted has a skull proportion that deviates from the strictly maintained Egyptian canon of human bodily proportions. The fingers in the carving show an unusual joint count rendered in a specific style, and the neck and cervical region of the figure is depicted at a proportional length and a lateral angle that no Egyptian artist ever used when rendering a human subject. The Egyptian artistic tradition maintained a canon of bodily proportion enforced with remarkable consistency over 4,000 years of production. When those proportions deviate in surviving work, the deviation is intentional and communicative. Egyptian artists were not making mistakes when they carved the figure on JE 89289. They were recording what the being they depicted actually looked like, using the same visual precision they applied to administrative records of grain distributions and military campaigns. The block has been sitting in that storage facility for over 50 years. The compound glyph has appeared in academic citations 11 times in all that period, always as a footnote to other arguments, never as the subject of a study that directly engages the obvious question the designation raises. To find the answer to that question in the written record, you have to go to the Aramaic. The Book of Enoch is not a fringe text. Fragments of it in Aramaic, cataloged as 4Q 201 through 4Q 212 and 4Q 206 at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. More copies of Enoch were recovered there than copies of Deuteronomy, more than Exodus. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has included it in its biblical canon continuously since the earliest period of that institution's existence. The Western Church removed it from authorized scripture in 364 CE at the Council of Laodicea. What the text describes in its core narrative is a class of beings it calls the Watchers, members of a divine order that descended into the physical world and produced offspring with human women. The offspring are called the Nephilim, a term that also appears in Genesis chapter 6. The mainstream theological reading treats all of this as symbolic language for moral corruption, an interpretive choice that requires ignoring everything the text says about physical form. The Book of Enoch is not symbolic about the Watchers. Chapter 8 catalogs what the Watchers transmitted to human civilization. Azazel taught metalworking and weapons. Shemyaza taught the signs of the earth. Barakal taught astrology. Kokabil taught the mapping of constellations. These are practical technical skills, requiring physical demonstration by a physical teacher. You cannot transmit metallurgical knowledge as an abstraction. You need hands on hot metal over time. The Watchers had hands. The Aramaic fragment 4, Q206, dated to approximately 100 BCE, contains a passage in chapter 17 that the standard English translations, including R.H., Charles's foundational 1906 edition, either compress or omit entirely. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the standard scholarly reference, identified this passage as containing geographical and physical language inconsistent with purely symbolic literature. It uses compass directions, depth measurements, and specific material descriptions in the manner of a survey report rather than an allegory. Embedded in that passage is a physical description of the Watchers that applies to no other category of being in the entire Enochic corpus. The head shape is described as extending beyond the natural limit of man. The fingers are described as reaching one joint further than any human finger reaches. The spine is described as capable of a turning motion not present in the children of Adam, head extending beyond the natural limit, fingers reaching one joint further, spine capable of a turning motion not present in the children of Adam. Al-Rashidi's field notes. The skull holding 2,900 cubic centimeters with a single parietal plate and inverted bone thickness distribution. The hands with 4 phalanges per finger across all 10 digits of both hands. The spine with 9 cervical vertebrae and facet joint geometry, producing 180 degrees of lateral rotation in either direction. The Aramaic text describes the anatomy in the 1st century BCE. The sealed chamber beneath Saqqara contained the anatomy. These are not adjacent conversations being forced into artificial connection by modern interpretation. These are the same physical measurements appearing in 2 separate records separated by 3,000 years. And 3,000 years is not the only separation. The Babylonian material adds a third, and the Babylonian material is visual. The Babylonians were the direct inheritors of the Sumerian written tradition. When they codified what they received into their own cosmological and historical framework, they added one element the Sumerian tablets had left implicit. They recorded what these beings looked like in physical carved form, in a visual tradition consistent enough and specific enough to cross-reference against both the textual record and the skeletal evidence from Saqqara. The Sumerian corpus from Ur, Nippur, and the sites that preceded them constitutes the oldest continuous written record on Earth. Within that corpus, the Anunnaki appear in the administrative registers described in ways that theological abstractions are not described. The Sumerian texts record what they ate, what they built, where they lived, and what they required from the human populations they managed. One passage from the Nippur corpus describes the Anunnaki hands as reaching where ours do not. The scholarly translation has consistently rendered this as a metaphor of authority, but the Sumerian word ki denotes physical location, physical space. It is not a metaphor of power. It is a statement about physical extension. Their hands reach a physical place that human hands do not. The Babylonians, inheriting this description, carved it in stone. The beings they called Apkallu, described as 7 wise teachers sent before the flood, appear across multiple cylinder seals and wall relief carvings in a visual form that has been sitting in museum collections in Berlin, London, and Chicago for over 150 years. The Apkallu iconography shows extended cranial regions projecting upward and backward from the brow at a proportion no unmodified human skull achieves. Their hands in the relief carvings show a joint count per finger that differs from the Babylonian convention for human subjects. The convention for human hands shows 3 knuckle segments per finger. The Apkallu hands consistently show 4. The Babylonian visual tradition did not add anatomical details to communicate theological meaning. When a Babylonian priest wore a fish-headed costume in ritual context, it was because the ritual enacted the role of an Apkallu, approximating a being with a documented physical appearance. The ritual was a memory. The original had a specific physical form, and that form, carved with the same precision applied to military records and administrative registers, had 4 joint segments per finger and a skull region that no human head contains. Genesis chapter 6 is the most compressed record of this entire tradition in the biblical text. The passage reads, in the King James rendering, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown." 6 verses covering what the book of Enoch expands into several complete chapters. The compression is so severe the passage reads as a passing reference, a mention of something the original audience understood without requiring explanation. The sons of God, the Nephilim, the mighty men of renown. These were established designations for beings that 4 separate traditions had been describing in their own languages across a span of history reaching back before writing itself. The physical result of what Genesis describes in 6 verses, what Enoch describes across several chapters, what the Sumerian records describe in the language of property management, and what the Babylonian visual tradition carved onto cylinder seals and palace walls is a being that matches what al-Rashidi documented before watching it get sealed away under a ministry preservation order in 1998. The skull that holds nearly double the cranial capacity of any documented human or related hominin. The single parietal plate built as one structure rather than 2 fused halves. The 9 cervical vertebrae with facet joint geometry producing a rotational range that human anatomy cannot achieve without structural failure. The hands with 4 bones in every finger giving 40% more length and 1 additional articulation point at every distal tip of both hands. The 4 traditions were not describing different things in different languages. They were describing the same thing from 4 different positions across several thousand years of independent record. The Egyptian compound glyph called them those who arrived before the counting of years. The Aramaic Enoch called them watchers, whose bodies were built to specifications the children of Adam do not carry. The Sumerian corpus called them Anunnaki, who managed human civilization from a position of physical capability beyond what their human contemporaries possessed. The Babylonian tradition carved their faces and their hands in stone and left those carvings in the ground for whoever would eventually understand what they were looking at. All 4 traditions said this being existed physically. All 4 described its physical characteristics in enough detail to identify it by anatomical measurement. And in 1998, inside a sealed, undisturbed chamber beneath the oldest monument complex on Earth, a physical specimen was recovered that matched those characteristics bone for bone. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities sealed the chamber and classified the evidence within 6 weeks of its discovery. Al-Rashidi gave 1 interview and went silent. The photographs sit in a restricted archive. The block JE 89289 sits in a storage facility at Saqqara and has not been formally studied since 1971. The Aramaic fragment 4Q206 is behind glass at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The Sumerian tablets from the Nippur corpus are cataloged and accessible, translated in ways that have consistently avoided engaging with what the physical language in those translations actually states. The chamber is sealed. The block is in storage. The fragments are behind glass. But the record is not sealed. The record is sitting in 4 separate manuscript traditions, in 2 museum catalogs with verifiable accession numbers, in 1 set of classified field photographs, and in field notes whose author stopped writing for 40 minutes after completing his measurements and then called Cairo. Al-Rashidi turned the recorder off 3 times during his 2001 interview. Whatever he saw in that chamber, he understood clearly what it was and what it was not. He had spent 30 years measuring skulls, examining spinal columns, documenting human remains across the full range of Egyptian history, from pre-dynastic to late period. He knew what human anatomy looked like in every condition a burial environment produces. What was in that chamber was not human anatomy. 4 separate ancient traditions across several thousand years said this being existed, said it had walked in the world before the dynasties, said its skull extended beyond the natural limit, its fingers reached 1 joint further, and its spine turned in a way the children of Adam cannot replicate. The skull, the spine, the hands. The text described the anatomy. The bone confirmed the texts. Whatever the Watchers were, whatever the Anunnaki administered, whatever the Apkallu taught, and whatever the compound glyph on JE89289 was designating when it carved those words beneath the Saqqara Plateau, one of them ended up in a sealed chamber that predates the first pharaoh. And the 4 traditions that recorded their existence across thousands of years of independent writing were each, in their own language, pointing directly at that chamber, those who arrived before the counting of years. The counting has started again.